The people who drew Canada's northern border didn't have a reason to care about it. For most of the 20th century, the Arctic wasn't a place you developed. It was a place you survived, if you were unlucky enough to end up there. Frozen for most of the year, locked behind sea ice that made shipping impossible, sitting on top of permafrost that made building almost anything a losing proposition. Nobody fought over it, because there was nothing worth fighting over. That's changing faster than almost anywhere else on the planet, and the reason isn't politics, it's temperature. Canada's Arctic is warming at nearly 3 times the global average rate, and in some regions, even faster than that. Ground that stayed frozen for thousands of years is thawing in places for the first time in recorded history. Sea ice that used to seal off shipping routes for 11 months a year is starting to open for longer stretches every summer. And underneath all of that thawing ground sits some of the most valuable, least developed geology left on Earth. This is a story about a region that spent a century being ignored, and what happens when the thing that made it worthless disappears. Let's start with the numbers, because the numbers are almost hard to believe. Environment and Climate Change Canada has stated plainly that the country's overall warming rate is roughly double the global average. The Arctic doesn't just follow that pattern, it blows past it. Multiple federal and academic studies now put Arctic Canada's warming rate at close to 3 to 4 times the global figure, a phenomenon scientists call Arctic amplification. It happens because less sea ice means less white surface reflecting sunlight back into space, which means more heat gets absorbed by dark open ocean, which melts more ice, which absorbs more heat. It's a feedback loop, and it's been running for decades. The Mackenzie District in the Western Arctic warmed by about 2.6 degrees Celsius between 1948 and 2014. Nunavut warmed by roughly 1.6 degrees over that same stretch. Canada's national land temperature overall has climbed by about 1.7 degrees Celsius since 1948, and almost all of the fastest-moving numbers are coming out of the north. That might not sound dramatic on its own. A couple of degrees doesn't feel like much when you're talking about a place that's already brutally cold. But a couple of degrees is exactly the threshold that matters, because it's the difference between ground that stays frozen and ground that doesn't. Permafrost across the high Arctic has been warming at a rate of roughly 3 to 5 tenths of a degree Celsius per decade. And in a region where infrastructure, roads, pipelines, entire buildings have been engineered around the assumption that the ground beneath them never moves, that's not a minor inconvenience. That's a structural problem. It's also, strangely enough, an opportunity. Because the same thaw that's cracking foundations in Inuit communities is also opening up land and water that used to be sealed off for most of the year. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Because underneath that frozen ground sits some of the most concentrated mineral wealth on the continent. Arctic Canada's geology holds diamonds, gold, and a long list of the rare earth and critical minerals that modern economies can't function without, that include the elements that go into batteries, wind turbines, fighter jets, and every single smartphone on Earth. When you think of how many people across the globe own a smartphone, the cost of raw materials that go into producing these phones are going to skyrocket, which makes Canada's mineral wealth something that other countries can dream about. For most of the last century, none of that mattered, because getting equipment in and or out of a region with no roads, no ports, and only a few weeks of open water a year made extraction close to impossible. That calculation is starting to shift. In Nunavut, a long-stalled proposal called the Grays Bay Port and Road Project has been revived. A plan for a deep-water port on the central Arctic coast connected by road to Yellowknife, designed specifically to move mineral resources out through international shipping lanes. It's the kind of infrastructure nobody would have bothered building 30 years ago, because the ice made the payoff too small and the risk too large. Warmer water and a longer shipping season are changing that math. And that brings us to the second piece of this story, because it isn't only about what's buried in the ground, it's about what happens on top of the water. For most of human history, the fastest way to move cargo between Asia and Europe has run through either the Suez Canal or the Panama Canal. Both of them narrow, both of them congested, both of them geographically fixed thousands of miles from the Arctic. But there's a third route that's existed the entire time, one that's simply been frozen shut. The Northwest Passage cuts through Canada's Arctic archipelago, linking the Pacific to the Atlantic through a maze of islands north of the mainland. Sail it successfully, and you cut roughly 4,000 kilometers off the standard route between East Asia and Western Europe. For most of the last 100 years, that route existed only on a map. Thick, unpredictable, year-round ice made it borderline suicidal for regular cargo traffic. A handful of icebreaker-escorted ships made the crossing as a novelty, not as a business plan. In 2013, a bulk carrier called the Nordic Orion became one of the first commercial vessels to make the trip with an icebreaker alongside it, shaving about 4 days and roughly $200,000 off its journey. That was treated as a curiosity at the time. It's increasingly starting to look like a preview. Arctic summer sea ice has been shrinking for decades, and the retreat isn't slowing down. Scientists tracking the ice have documented a steady decline in extent year over year, and climate projections now suggest that large stretches of the Canadian Arctic could see ice-free conditions for at least a month each summer within the coming decades. That doesn't mean cargo ships start running the Northwest Passage on a regular schedule tomorrow. Ice conditions are still unpredictable. The waters are barely charted compared to major shipping lanes elsewhere, and search and rescue infrastructure across the Arctic is thin at best. But every year the ice retreats a little further, the math on that route gets a little more attractive. And shipping companies have never needed much of an excuse to chase a shorter, cheaper path between two of the largest economies on Earth. Put those two things together, the minerals underneath the permafrost and the shipping route opening up above it, and you start to see why a region that spent a century being treated as empty space is suddenly showing up in strategy documents in Ottawa, Washington, and Beijing. A resource nobody could reach becomes valuable the moment somebody can reach it. And ice, more than almost any other geographic feature on the planet, is the kind of barrier that can simply stop existing. Of course, none of this makes the Arctic an easy place to build anything. It's still one of the most punishing environments on the continent, with winter temperatures across much of the territory regularly dropping past -40, a point on the thermometer where Celsius and Fahrenheit actually converge, because it's cold enough that the scale barely matters anymore. Communities are scattered and small, some of them accessible only by ice road for a few weeks a year, or by air the rest of the time. Building a port, a mine, or a road in that environment costs multiples of what the same project would cost almost anywhere else in Canada. Warmer ground sounds like an advantage, until you remember that thawing permafrost also means less stable foundations, more erosion, and infrastructure that has to be engineered for conditions that are actively shifting under it. The Arctic isn't turning into Ohio. It's turning into something that's slightly less impossible than it used to be. And in a region this remote, slightly less impossible is enough to change the economics entirely. There is also the question of who actually controls all of this. Because a navigable Northwest Passage and an accessible mineral basin don't stay quiet for long. Canada has consistently maintained that the waters running through its Arctic islands, including the passage itself, are internal Canadian waters, not an international strait open to any country's shipping. Not every government agrees, and as the ice retreats and the value of that corridor becomes harder to ignore, that disagreement isn't going away. Add in a global race for the raw materials that power batteries and defense technology, and Canada's north stops being a forgotten edge of the map and starts looking like exactly the kind of place great powers have fought over throughout history, just usually somewhere warmer. None of this happened because Canada planned it that way. Nobody surveyed the Arctic archipelago a century ago and calculated that a warming planet would eventually turn a frozen maze of islands into a shortcut between two oceans. Or that permafrost thaw would eventually make extraction viable in a place that used to defeat every attempt to build there. The geography was always there. The minerals were always there. The shipping route was always geometrically the shortest path between two of the wealthiest regions on Earth. All of it sat frozen shut, waiting on a variable nobody controlled. Now, the ice is doing what ice does when the planet warms, and a region that spent 100 years being the emptiest space on the map is turning into one of the most contested. The cold used to be the thing that protected the Arctic from the rest of the world. It's not going to protect it much longer. The world has a structure. Let's keep finding it.